Hello and welcome back to another KCC video. I'm Rob and today we're jumping into malicious compliance. Before we start, please hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you know when the next video goes live. Our first story today comes to us from Cole Carmont. If you don't like the way I teach, why don't you complain to someone about it? Let's jump right in. So today at work we were talking about my rather bad handwriting, and it reminded me that perhaps the proudest moment of my life could be considered malicious compliance. If it is not, I apologize, but the reason why I am posting this is because I did what I did with the intention to get my teacher in trouble, which worked in the long term, but I did not expect the events to follow my compliance to occur. This story is also quite long, which I also apologize for as well. This took place roughly 19 years ago when I was in middle school. I had and still have a disability that prevents me from writing legibly. However, my parents quickly learned I had an insane typing speed. As a result, my ADHD psychologist and parents got me an Alpha Smart word processor for my 5th grade Christmas present. It would be an understatement to say this was a life changer. My assignments became so much easier. I knew the stuff but couldn't write it down. My attitude about school changed, and I became the hip popular kid at school for having this fancy new piece of cutting-edge technology. None of my teachers between the 5th and 7th grade had an issue with this, and were quite impressed by the technology. Mind you, word processors weren't exactly new, but seeing them in schools were unheard of at this point, as they were quite expensive. This changed in the 8th grade with Mrs. Grump. Mrs. Grump was your traditional old woman who looked like my great-great-grandmother. Gray hair, wrinkles upon wrinkles, a bead necklace that reached past her breast, flower print outfits, and clip-on earrings. Seriously, she was one bobbed hairdo away from being Karen's grandmother. First day I took my word presser out, she was on my back. Anytime she saw me with it, she would threaten to take it from me and reduce my marks for the class. I recall myself standing up for myself the first time, but I was never one to argue with my teachers. I never needed to because my teachers up until then were completely understanding. When she said no, I backed off. At that point, school became miserable for me. When I typed up my assignments, Mrs. Grump lowered my marks for not being handwritten. Anytime I asked her if I could stay after class to finish my assignments or finish writing down my notes, she would lower my marks on the next assignment for wasting her time. Anytime asked a friend for help while in class, you guessed it, she would lower my marks. Luckily, as most of my fellow students understood my problems, a group of them approached me and offered to help me. They started offering me their notes each evening so I could bring them home and photocopy so I could keep up with everything. We also hung out in the library at lunches, and they actually helped me with my handwriting so it could be at the very least legible, allowing me to write out my homework despite it taking super long. I genuinely don't know what her problem was, but she began reducing my marks because of poor handwriting and inspecting my binders to make sure I wasn't stealing other people's work. If she found a photocopied note, say it with me, she would lower my marks. This was absolutely ridiculous as none of my classmates were marked in such a way. Now, as I explained, I am not one to question authority. Despite being miserable with Mrs. Grump's attitude, I quietly accepted I would probably fail. Unfortunately, I don't remember why my parents didn't help, but I think it might have been due to my older brother being part of Mrs. Grump's in the past, and they thought I was being overdramatic. ADHD, remember? With the background out of the way, on to the compliance. I don't know what happened this particular day, but I had a sudden surge of confidence. It was a particularly bad day. I remember we were doing an assignment involving microscopes in class. We needed to describe what we saw, and instinctively I brought out my word processor. I put it on the table and looked down into the microscope, but when I came back up, Mrs. Grump was standing at my desk with my word processor in her hand. I am confiscating this and throwing it away, but I need it and it's expensive. Too bad, I have warned you many times not to bring it out in my class. You didn't listen, and so these are the consequences. At this point, she put it in her cabinet unit and shut the door. Everyone in the class was silent, and Mrs. Grump sat back down. Some of my classmates tried to calm me down, I was crying and Mrs. Grump didn't care. In particular, I recall, of all people, one of the students who usually bullied me trying to cheer me up. We'll call him Jim from now on, as Jim now works as a coach at a gym now. I didn't work on the assignment, and when Mrs. Grump came to take my blank sheet, she scoffed. "If you don't like the way I teach, why don't you complain to someone about it?" I left the classroom, defeated, but to my surprise, during lunch, Jim came up to me with my word processor in hand. He stole it out of the teacher's cabinet while she was returning the microscopes to the lab. He told me he was going to keep it in his locker till after school when he'll return it. That way, I wouldn't get in even more trouble when she finds it missing. It was at that moment when I snapped. I don't know what it was. Maybe the fact that the person who had bullied me for so long was the one helping me, but I wanted Mrs. Grump gone. But what was I going to do? Well, complain to someone, of course. She is the teacher, and it's not like me to disobey the teacher. Now, in any other situation, I honestly don't think this would have worked, but I got extremely lucky in regards to the events that followed this decision. So myself and Jim went to the school's principal during lunch. Me and the principal, up until this point, had never officially met, as she had just started at the school this year after the previous principal retired. We are going to call the principal Mrs. Awesome. Mrs. Awesome was eating at her desk and was surprised to be interrupted, though she did sigh when she saw Jim. I know for a fact those two were well acquainted. I think she thought the two of us had gotten a fight, so she asked me to sit down and for Jim to wait outside. I started explaining to her what happened in class, and after she realized Jim wasn't to blame, she called him back in to support my story. When I mentioned the word processor, however, her eyes lit up. Despite never formally talking before, it was clear she knew who I was. The discussion shifted to the word processor itself, and she asked me to go over its functions and everything. I showed her how I could type on it, transfer the files to a computer to either print off or email, the typing tutorials loaded on it. I explained why I needed it, showing her my handwriting and how I had relied on it since the 5th grade. She and Jim seemed quite interested in it, taking notes and everything. At the end of the impromptu tutorial that lasted, Mrs. Awesome thanked me and had us step out for the moment. After she brought me back in, she explained to me that there was nothing she could do at this point in time. She gave me an out-of-school suspension for a week, but explained I was not in trouble at all, and it wasn't being marked against me. The explanation I believe she gave was for stealing out of the teacher's cabinet, though I wasn't required to return the word processor. This also got Jim out of trouble as well, which he was thankful for. Mrs. Awesome said that everything will be taken care of next week when I return, and she'll contact my parents explaining the situation. The week I was off, Jim was coming by and dropping off his homework so I could photocopy it and not fall behind. Quite frankly, at first I thought he just wanted me to do his work for him, as it was a complete 180 on how he used to treat me, but we became good friends after this happened. Even asking him today, Jim doesn't recall why he started treating me better after Mrs. Grump took my word processor. During those days, my parents were on the phone constantly. I wasn't aware what was going on, but they bought me a new game, bought takeout a lot. Genuinely, I felt pampered. My parents came in with me when I returned, but rather than to the classroom, I was brought to the school's boardroom instead, where a bunch of people in suits were. My family doctor and ADHD psychologist was also in attendance, which honestly shocked me. Mrs. Awesome explained to me that these were representatives from the school board and that they were extremely interested in my word processor. In hindsight, it was a bit of a dick move for no one to inform me that I was being brought in front of the school board to present my word processor, but I began explaining it like I did to Mrs. Awesome, showing the different functions and such. After I finished, my family doctor and psychologist gave a better explanation than what I gave as to why I needed it and how it helped, and ended with my parents explaining how it has changed my education and how I enjoyed school. Honestly, I don't recall the immediate response, but a day later, Mrs. Awesome did explain everything to me. Apparently, she was actually a sitting member of the school board who had been standing in as principal that year until they found a replacement. When I showed her the word processor, she saw the potential they had to help students such as her own daughter who had similar circumstances as me. She contacted the school board about potentially investing in some word processors for each school in the district for the next year, but they wanted to see it first. Again, this was a rather new concept, all things considered. That's why she needed me that day, and why she allowed me to stay home for the week, as there was no rule in place to protect the word processor from being confiscated and possibly destroyed. I still question why I was never informed until the actual meeting, but whatever. Anyways, due to the presentation, I was given permission to continue working on my word processor, much to Mrs. Grump's dismay. She was also required to adjust all my previous marks to remove her deductions. Meanwhile, the school board decided on ordering 5 to 8 word processors for each school in the district for the next year. This school getting 8 as it was a larger school. Students in what was called resource class, basically a class for students who needed extra attention, had the option to sign out the word processors for a day to help work on their in-school assignments. There was an altogether increase of the resource students' marks as a result of this change, I've been told, and the school board began looking into other ways to help students. But what about Mrs. Grump? Other than having to readjust my marks and allowing me to use my word processor, she got off scot-free. It's great and all that I made a huge difference in my school district, but how did Mrs. Grump get her just desserts for making 8th grade a living hell for me? Well, I don't know if this was mere coincidence, outside interference, or a parting gift from Mrs. Awesome after she returned to her position in the school board, but all resource students coming into the 8th grade had been assigned to Mrs. Grump's class the next year, and as a result, they were signing out the word processors constantly in her class. I learned this because my 9th grade class was right across the hall from her classroom, and windows in the classrooms allowed me to look across into her class and see 4 to 6 students typing up a storm on their word processors. This came to a head, however, when Mrs. Grump took one of the word processors and threw it out the window. After that, Mrs. Grump was asked to retire halfway through the school year and replaced with the sweetest teacher that held ice cream parties for the students that completed all their homework assignments each month. And that, everyone, is probably the proudest moment in my life. Not only did my actions result in students with disabilities getting more resources to help them, but I also watched the worst teacher I ever had the pleasure of meeting get escorted out of the school by security. I wish more schools had principals like this. I had major issues in school with being bullied, and the principal would tell me, well, what did you do to deserve it? What did you do to egg them on? It totally didn't help that my mom was a substitute teacher, but that's a story for another day. Thank you to OP for posting their story in the Malicious Compliance subreddit. They are linked in the description below. Please go there and check them out. Check out one of these other videos, and if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button for more daily Reddit stories.